we will try to keep a bit an alternation between questions in the room and questions online. Yes, and the last thing that I wanted to mention is that this meeting or this seminar is being recorded. So I think we are done with this introduction. Thank you very much, everyone, for being with us today, especially to our speaker. And Simon, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Daniele. Give me 1 second. I think I meant to just share the screen. Oops, here we go. So it's a great pleasure to be back, and it's great actually to see around the table old friends and new from various points in my academic career. What I'm going to talk about today is both some general views about Brexit that I've had since, I guess, the days after the Brexit vote in June 2016, and also some results of research that we've just done, which was a survey experiment to try and get a sense of what trade-offs there might be in Brexit. So my general view is that I found particularly frustrating in the Brexit debate the focus on the short term, what's happening tomorrow, what's happening next week, what's happening next month, and very little discussion about the medium term. What should the relationship between the UK and the EU be in 5 or say 10 years? And maybe it's just too raw on both sides to think about that. But unless we in the academy start sort of pushing that envelope, I think it's almost, the politicians, I was deeply frustrated trying to get any resonance amongst any of the politicians in any of the political parties in the UK to try and articulate a medium-term vision of what the relationship might look like, rather than what the immediate trade and cooperation agreement, the immediate Brexit deal was going to look like. So what I'm going to talk about is the nature of the Brexit bargain. I think of Brexit, the actual Brexit process, and the day that the UK left the EU as the beginning of the end of the beginning, to coin a phrase from Churchill, not the end at all, but the end of the beginning, the end of the first stage, the start of a new relationship. I'll say a little bit about whether I think the Brexit deal is movable, and if so, in what direction is it potentially movable? And that's what we tried to elicit in our survey experiment. We designed a survey experiment to try and force voters or respondents in the survey to make trade-offs across policy issues. And then I'll show you some of the results. So the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is a new stage in the relationship. If you like, it's a particular equilibrium as a result of a particular set of red lines on the two sides. Of course, from the UK side, the UK insisted very early on that they wanted to end the free movement of people, get out of the single market and the customs union, and outside the Court of Justice of the EU jurisdiction. If you look like, that's the sort of Florence the May speech and where we've been heading since that speech. For the EU side, said from very early on, how Merkel put it, no cherry picking. I mean, basically, we're not going to allow any, you can't pick one bit of the 4 freedoms without having the other bits of the 4 freedoms. And it's interesting, since then, I've been involved in a project on differentiated integration, and it's absolutely clear that the EU has bespoke relationships with every single one of its external partners. So in a sense, the no cherry picking mantra was a political decision of the EU with the case of the UK, and we can perhaps return to that. So the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is, if you like, a basic free trade agreement. 0 tariffs and quotas, sorry, that should say quotas, not quotes, but regulatory and customs checks with some limitations on regulatory alignment for the UK. Very little on services trade, in fact, probably less on services trade in the TCA than there is in the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement. Complete end to the free movement of people, no UK payments into the budget except for UK participation of Horizon Europe, but that is only temporary and conditional, and it's a short-term arrangement and will be reviewed by the UK Treasury. It's a particular package. Just as an aside, I get deeply frustrated by the term free trade agreement. There's no such thing as a free trade agreement. And I think the mantra, the libertarian Brexiteers had in their head the idea that free trade means mutual recognition. A free trade agreement is not free trade. It should be called a regulated trade agreement. It's an agreement to exchange goods, a subset of goods and services according to a fixed set of rules. That's not free trade. The only genuinely free trade in the kind of libertarian notion of free trade is in the single market. I think that they learned that through the process of Brexit. If you think of it as a continuum, I think you'd put the trade cooperation agreement towards the harder end of the spectrum. If you think the softer end would be at the UK joining the EEA like Norway, there was some discussion of an EEA minus, which would be the UK in the EEA, but removing the free movement of people, immediately taken off the table by the EU. The UK then talks about an FTA plus, or at certain points, an FTA plus, plus, plus. The main plus here was services trade. The idea would be a comprehensive agreement on services based on mutual recognition, in addition to essentially a goods-based agreement. Then you have the basic FTA, which is essentially a goods-based old-style free trade agreement, and then no deal or the WTO. The debate about softer and harder Brexit shifted through the Brexit process, in the sense what we were talking about, the FTA plus, plus, plus as a hard Brexit, and we ended up talking about the FTA plus, plus, plus as a soft Brexit, and the no deal being a hard Brexit. Well, actually, where we've ended up is pretty hard. Another way to think of it is not as a linear continuum, much more of a multi-dimensional deal with a set of trade-offs, where you can have a closer or softer relationship on one dimension and a further or harder relationship on another dimension. So, for example, you could have much closer relationship on free movement of goods, much harder relationship on regulatory alignment, closer relationship on free movement of people, a harder relationship on payments into the budget, and so on. It does not necessarily have to be linear. I mean, it was interesting if you think about the Barnier perspective, the famous Barnier staircase. He presented it as linear. This was a political decision. Presented it to say, okay, you have one red line, it leads you down the staircase. You have another red line, it leads you another step down the staircase, and so on. And as a result of those red lines, you will end up with basically an FTA. Interestingly, the UK press always called it a Canada-style relationship. They didn't like to call it a South Korean-style relationship. Canada, I guess, sounds sort of cuddly and soft and nice. And South Korea, the reason they didn't call it South Korea is clearly racist, but anyway, that just is a comment on the British idea that, oh, well, how bad can it be if we're like Canada? But if we think about the fact that we ended up in this FTA, basic FTA, why did we end up in this? And I had another paper published a couple of years ago where I looked at this and argued that this is where we were going to be heading if you just looked at the rank ordering of the preferences of the two sides. So if you think about the four basic options, big package options on the table, the UK's primary option was first choice would have been an FTA plus, then the basic FTA, then the Norway minus, then the EEA, if you look at the UK's red lines. And from the EU side, the EEA would have been their first choice if the UK was willing to accept that, keep the UK in the single market, but at arm's length. A basic FTA would have been the second choice, and anything else would have been dangerous, would have allowed certain cherry picking that could have potentially had knock-on effects on other relationships that the EU has. So as a result of this, if you think of this as a sort of non-cooperative game between the two sides, you can see how if the EU is playing hardball and saying you've got a choice between the basic FTA and the EEA agreement, then of course the UK is going to choose the basic FTA. So those numbers in the boxes there are the sort of rank ordering there. The blue are the EU's rank ordering, the red are the UK's rank ordering. And so we've ended up in, if you like, a suboptimal equilibrium, not the ideal outcome from both sides. But what's nice about this is I think it lets you think about where we might end up. What would it take to shift from this equilibrium? So what would it take for the UK to end up in a sort of EEA type arrangement? We've called this a type 1 shift. You'd have to see a dramatic change in domestic politics in the UK. You wouldn't have to see much change from the EU side, but you'd have to see a dramatic change in domestic politics in the UK. This might happen, not in the short term, but in the medium term. This might happen if, I think, say, Labour comes out and says, we actually want a softer relationship. We want to be in the single market. We want a jobs first type Brexit arrangement. We want, you know, if there's long-term consequences of the UK being outside the customs union, the regulatory checks and so on. If Northern Ireland looks like it's benefiting, people could argue, why not extend the Northern Ireland deal to the rest of the UK and so on? Let's join the customs union. unlikely at the moment. We'd have to accept the free movement of persons and ECJ jurisprudence. What would it take to shift in the other direction? Let's say a comprehensive deal on services. It wouldn't take much change in the UK, but it would need a significant change on the EU side. I don't think the EU is ready for that. I think that the EU is worried about the potential knock-on consequences. I remember talking to a French MEP in the middle of Brexit, and he said to me, don't think we're going to do a comprehensive deal on services that allows Anglo-Saxon bankers free access to the continental services market. And then, of course, the other way would involve double shift on both sides. So it's even more unlikely. So I think, ironically, it was pretty obvious early on where I think we were going to end up if you just logically followed and believed the red lines as credible. We were going to end up in this basic trade agreement as the starting point of the new relationship. So what we then thought was, okay, this is the starting point of this new relationship. What would it take to shift this new relationship? So let's get a sense of public attitudes towards medium-term trade-offs. We undertook what's called a conjoint experiment. These are experiments that are now widely used in political science, political economy. It came out of the study of marketing, in fact, in the 1980s and early 90s. It's where you have a series of choices or a series of dimensions, and you have a set of choices across those dimensions, which I'm going to explain in a minute. And you then give respondents a choice between two packages. Do you prefer package A or package B across these options? Do you prefer package B and package C across these options, and so on? So, it was originally like marketing toasters. Do you want a toaster to be red or blue? Do you want it to be large or small, and so on, right? Why we thought this was an interesting way to do it is because a lot of the survey data just asks voters, respondents' preferences in the UK. Do you think we should align to EU regulatory standards? Do you think we should pay into the EU budget? Do you think we should end free movement of people? Do you think we should have free access to the single market, and so on? And then they come back and say, look, the British public wants to have its cake and eat it. Well, they haven't asked people, if you were forced to make a trade-off between these things, which ones would you prefer? Sarah Hobart, my former colleague at LSE, has a nice conjoint experiment that tries to do that. But what she does is she has a long list of options, which is nice for identifying the individual magnitude effect of each of the potential choices people make, but doesn't give you an overall package. Because if you think about the more options you add in this type of experiment, the number of alternative overall packages just explodes. So what we did is we had four very discrete dimensions, two choices on each of those dimensions, which gives you an overall total of 16 potential packages. And so with that, we can try and identify the relative popularity of each of these issues and also the overall packages. Now, that might sound complicated. I'm going to talk you through it. It's quite simple. So these are our options, and we tried to describe these options in very simple ways that people would understand. And they were options designed for the sort of post-Brexit world. So we did the survey just after the UK had actually left. We did the survey in March of 2020. This was before actually we'd ended the transition period, but after we'd formally left the EU. So we focused on four areas: market access, regulatory alignment, movement of people, and payments into the budget. And so market access is a softer option, is very few restrictions on the export of UK goods and services, significant restrictions and taxes on the export of goods and services. Regulatory alignment, UK agrees to align environment, labour and consumer standards. UK is free to design its own standards. End the free movement of people between the UK and the EU, except for high-skilled workers. So the reason why we did this was not because it's now post-Brexit. So it's about what might happen next. It's not that we would move immediately to the return of the complete free movement of people. What the debate is about is whether we keep the end of the complete free movement of people, or we start to relax it for different sectors. And the first sector where there's a lot of pressure is for high-skilled labour. UK makes some payments into the EU budget to remain part of European-wide scientific research and educational exchange programs, or the UK does not make any payments and does not participate. So simple ideas. And this is what it looks like to the voters. So, each package was a sort of randomly picked from dimension 1, dimension 2, dimension 3, dimension 4, and you put them up against each other and you say, do you prefer package A or package B? And then we do it again, and we do it again, and we do it again. And we did it like 5 times for each photo, for each respondent. From that, you get out the following. So this is then the 8 possible, the marginal effects of each of those 8 options. So this is the probability a package is chosen if it has one of those options in it. So it gives you the sort of relative importance or relative significance or relative power of one of these options. And you can see down the bottom, very few restrictions on the export of UK goods and services was the option that had the highest power or highest influence, if you like. So almost 60% of those packages that had that in, regardless of everything else, controlling for everything else, were chosen. The next most powerful one, which we were surprised at, was end the free movement of people except for high-skilled workers. Then slightly behind that, wanting to participate in EU spending programs, research and education programs in return for paying to the budget, pretty similar to UK free to decide its own environmental labour standards. So that's the overall package. But what you can see is big differences between leave and remain voters. So here you have remain voters in the blue, leave voters in the red, and you can see for 2 of the dimensions, leave and remain voters were pretty similar. So you can see that on the movement of people. Both leave and remain voters preferred a package that would have free movement of high-skilled workers. Okay, that was interesting. Leave voters actually would be in favor of that. And equally, both of them preferred few restrictions, of course, on UK exports, but they differed on the other 2 dimensions. So they differ, of course, on regulatory alignment. So the Remainers preferred UK agrees to align its environment, labour, consumer standards. Leavers preferred UK is free to decide its own standards, and they differed on the payments into the budget. Okay, so that's at the individual item level. And then what you can do is put them together and come up with packages. So what were the most likely chosen packages on average? So this says, 72% of the time, that was the package that won in those binary setup choices against everything else, all the way down to the bottom one, 26% of the time. So on the left-hand side, you have a little green and orange there. Green shows it was the, for each of the 4 dimensions, green shows that was a softer option, and orange shows it was a harder option. And what we've got here is, was the package actually politically viable on the left-hand side? So the top 2 most preferred packages were sort of cake and eat it type packages. People want free access to the market, but no regulatory alignment, which was never going to happen, right? So the only packages that are really viable are the double greens in the first 2 columns or double oranges in those first 2 columns. And if you look at the TCA, it's quite a long way down. The actual trade and cooperation agreement and what's the terms of trade and cooperation agreement is actually not a particularly well preferred package overall. So overall, a package that says, sort of the third one down, the softest of soft, overall is the most preferred viable package, but huge disagreement between leavers and remainers. You can see there, the remainers, this was overwhelmingly the most preferred package. For leavers, it wasn't. The leavers much preferred a sort of cakeist type option, and the package, the most highly preferred package that the leavers, that was viable, is the one that is, I don't know if I can currently point. Doesn't really come out. It does. If you look down here, not viable, viable, but not very preferred. 55, 67 here. No, 59. Yeah, these 2 here. So, the leavers overwhelmingly are willing to say we give up market access in return for regulatory autonomy. So this is basically the battle. This is going to be the battle in the medium term. It's this argument about more access to the single market in return for less regulatory autonomy. And this is going to be the big battle. The interesting thing we also thought was to divide. The nice thing about the Vox Pop online panel that we use, they've got enough Scottish voters, so you can do Scotland. An interesting thing about Scotland, Scottish voters overall look much more like Remainers in terms of their preference structure. And so you can see here, Scottish voters over here really prefer this soft overall package. Of all the viable options, this was like almost 75% chosen by Scottish voters as opposed to English voters. English voters look more like the overall average of voters. The other thing we thought was, what's underlying this Brexit vote? What are some of the socioeconomic characteristics in our data set that predict whether you're a leave or a remain vote? So we looked at some of the standard things they look at in the literature, so education, class, and region. And clearly, at least for our data set, education, whether or not you were at university or not, was the biggest single sort of socioeconomic predictor of whether or not you were a leave or remain voter. So then we thought we'd break it down and look at education, university educated versus non-educated. And again, it's exactly as you'd expect. The educated voters want the soft, 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 soft. The lower educated voters are wanting these sort of non-viable packages, and the most preferred package of the lower educated voters actually is pretty soft, but interestingly, less educated voters are not wanting to pay into the EU budget in return for educational exchanges or research programs, which is rational from their point of view, right? They're not benefiting. So then what do we take away from this? And I think it's still very early days. It's too soon to tell whether or not Brexit is popular or not in the UK. And it changes over time in response to context and events. So this is the YouGov Brexit Tracker survey, which is every week they ask a question. Do you think Brexit was right or wrong? Do you think Britain was right or wrong to vote to leave the EU? And you can see the majority have said wrong in this data set as opposed to right, but it's gone in different directions. So this period here was actually when the UK was doing well in terms of its vaccine rollout relative to the EU. This is the period here where there are shortages on the shelves and there are worries that we won't be able to get our goods for Christmas because of the truck drivers, and there's fuel shortages and so on. So, it's very context specific. It will come a point where, because of the different economic cycles between the UK and the EU, that the UK economy is growing faster than the EU economy. And at that point, everybody will forget everything that's gone before. And then suddenly Brexit for the British public will look quite popular, and Brexit from the continent potentially could be dangerous and look quite popular. I think Brexit is potentially an existential crisis for the EU. It's not that other member states are going to be jumping on the bandwagon and say, oh, we want to leave. But at some point, Brexit will appear to be working. Relationship will start to settle down, will start to normalize, the British economy will readjust. Foreign direct investment will come back. Britain is still a relatively wealthy country after all, and Britain will be okay. And Britain being okay is potentially actually quite damaging politically to the continent. And I think I worry particularly about what it means for populist politicians in countries like not just Poland or Hungary, but also Sweden. Sweden with a very close relationship, of course, to Norway, close relationship to the UK historically, a very different political identity to a lot of the other countries in the continent of Europe, and the largest economy now outside the Eurozone. So it's interesting. I saw Catherine de Vries give a talk the other day, and she said something quite similar from her public opinion data that she's got. So the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, I don't think is the end of the story. I think it's the beginning of a new relationship. It's a pretty hard Brexit. The overall package is not particularly popular with anybody in the UK. It's not particularly popular with Leavers, not particularly popular with Remainers, not particularly popular with the average voters, certainly not popular in Scotland. There's already discussions of add-ons, of course, and already what we're starting to see is the addition of things into the treaty below the radar, or cooperation below the radar. So, for example, the UK announced that it was going to carry on applying the CE mark. It wasn't going to have the UK mark that they promised they were going to implement. And they said, oh, we'll delay it another year. We'll delay it another year. And it'll just get kicked into touch. And nobody will notice. We already got UK participation in Horizon Europe. There's pressure from the British universities to have some kind of Erasmus type relationship. Of course, we We're not allowed politically to call it Erasmus, but it could come under the umbrella of the Turing scheme in the UK that allows, within the Turing, there's a European pillar that allows Brits to exchange, so that's the sort of narrative that you'd have to play in the UK. Of course, there's a debate about the phytosanitary rules because, and the UK signing up to the sort of arrangement that Switzerland has. There's growing pressure from the services sector in the UK. The UK is a services economy. And when I say services economy, I don't just mean business and financial services. The second largest sector of the UK economy is the creative industries: film, fashion, art, design, media, higher education, architecture, and so on. And the film industry, the fashion industry, the music industry are lobbying like crazy to say, we want free movement of high-skilled workers. A good mate of mine, Andy, is Scots guy in London. He's an interior designer of cruise ships. And he says London is the world capital for interior design of cruise ships. We don't make the ships anymore, but we design them in London. Apparently there's 4 of the 8 largest firms in the world that design interior design for cruise ships are based in the West End in London. One of them's already left and moved to Hamburg. The other 3 are lobbying ferociously for free movement of high-skilled labor because he says when he gets a contract, he needs to be able to hire kitchen designers and bathroom designers and disco designers and swimming pool designers and everybody, and needs them in the office so they can brainstorm together and design the ship together on short-term flexible contracts based in London. And his talent pool is the European market. And he says, if I have to hire British designers, I go out of business. So that's essentially a microcosm of all of the creative industries in the UK, whether you're in software programming right through to architecture. Richard Rogers has been very vocal about the same challenges in the architecture. Coldplay have been very vocal, and so has Elton John, about not being able to travel around Europe and play. So that's the sort of sense of what's going on in terms of behind the scenes. So I think there's growing pressure for some kind of deal that would allow for particularly free movement of high-skilled labor. And of course, the public debate is about, the open public debate is about fruit pickers and healthcare workers and elderly care workers. And so there's sort of a sectoral deal perhaps to be done there. The central trade-off, we think, from this research suggests it is this market access versus regulatory alignment. I think actually you could get quite a consensus on adding an add-on on high-skilled labor, putting an add-on on UK paying into the budget to have access to different programs, and that could be extended to other types of programs. The trade-off, which is the most difficult, is this market access versus regulatory alignment. Interestingly, in Scotland, Scottish voters overwhelmingly prefer, on that trade-off in particular, a much softer relationship. And this potentially could drive at least an element of the argument over Scottish independence. Nicola Sturgeon feels like she has a mandate. She's going to push very much for it. She's a canny politician. She won't do it unless she feels she's got majority support amongst the public. The biggest weakness in the last Scottish referendum was the economic argument. So back in September 2014, the economic argument for Scottish independence was the big worry to lower income voters in Scotland. But now it's changing because vote for Scottish independence to save the Scottish economy, so that we can be part of the single market. That narrative is starting, and it's a little early to tell whether that has resonance because the impact of being outside the single market is wrapped up with the impact of the pandemic, and so it's very difficult to identify those effects. But if those effects accumulate over time, and there is a debate that identifies the effect of the UK being outside the single market and the economic effects of that, that will have an impact on the debate about Scottish independence. That's all I got for you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Simon. So the floor is open now for comments and questions. We'll start with maybe a comment or a question from the room, and then we'll go to those who are online. Gary, please go ahead.
Was there someone else then?
No, it's fine.
Okay. Look, that was brilliant. Really, it was really interesting. In terms of the conjoint, the way you presented it, and your results, very, very interesting. And also the PowerPoint. I'd like to get my hands on a couple of those slides there. I have really two questions. One, and this is something that Philip and Lisbeth and I just discussed as we were walking in here. So you include among the possibilities things that make no sense, that they have your cake and eat it. And so I have a simple question. It's kind of a naive question in a way, and that is, what difference would it make to your analysis if you excluded the have your cake and eat it? Does it? So is there a bias built in there? And I can talk about some possibilities, but let me just put that right in your lap to begin with. And then the second question is this: you finish actually with Switzerland, and so if the UK is going to have this a la carte kind of set of negotiations over time. Now, if you'd have put Switzerland on your original list, the UK would have liked Switzerland, and the EU would have said, look, having one Switzerland is enough already. And so, is there going to be a policy with respect to this a la carte bargaining?
On the first of those, I don't think it would have made a difference because we are just doing discrete pairwise comparisons. So in a sense, we could just drop out all of those pairwise comparisons that have one of those packages that is what we then thought of afterwards as a politically viable package, and then you just compare what's left. And I don't think it will make a difference. But we can run we can just drop them out and see if that's the case. Yeah, I'm not. It's a good point. We can rerun the stats of the estimations and the confidence intervals without them and see if that's a good point. On Switzerland, I mean, Switzerland is like a FTA ++++ type deal. It's a bespoke arrangement. But all of the EU's non-EEA arrangements are bespoke arrangements. And even within the EEA, in fact, there's slightly different side deals and on opt-outs and packages for Liechtenstein, for Norway, for Iceland, and so on. So in this InDiv EU project that I've been involved in, I've been doing the British side, but I've been learning about Turkey and Liechtenstein and Norway and Switzerland. And it's interesting, I came with a sort of classic view of the Barnier staircase type view, and I came away realizing there's a lot under the lid there that actually we don't talk about. Every single one of these deals is a bespoke deal of some kind. The EU does not like Switzerland because it's a pain and it takes up too much time, and Switzerland seems to be getting a pretty good deal on some areas and it's worried about then the knock-on effects of what that means on other type of arrangements that the EU has. But if you like it, whether you like it or not, at the end of the day, the UK, Brexit represents a new model of a new relationship with the EU. And so there's the EEA model, there would be the Swiss model, there'll be the British model and the Turkish model, and then the Canada/South Korea model. And there'll be different models, and that will have an effect inside the EU because some political forces will believe or argue we can just take off the shelf the UK model. And we can forget all the pain and suffering the UK went through to get there. We can just go there from point A to point B. They can't, but it'll look or feel like they can, particularly if at some point the UK looks like it's doing well and looks like it can have its cake and eat it and looks like it can do. That's the real worry, I think, from the EU's point of view, and why I think it was legitimate for Merkel to say no cherry picking, we're going to play hardball and so on. But I don't know how sustainable that is in the long run from the EU's perspective.
Ruth, please.
Thanks for that presentation. I've got two points. First one relates to the sample that you're using, which is convenience. Well, it's opt-in and then it's sort of convenience. So I wonder what your thoughts are about the role of that sample in terms of, is it a sample where you would suspect that there's a tendency to be more Remain, so that influences the sort of deals that they tend to prefer and the packages that they tend to prefer? Would probably not affect the sort of ordering too much, but it might affect the levels of support overall, I think. And then the second point relates to a point you made about under which conditions would we see change, and you sort of mentioned that who's in power, who's in government is important. So I was wondering if you've got the breakout by partisanship or party support. Are Labour identifiers preferring different packages than conservatives? Thanks.
Thank you. The sample, the VoxPop Labs panel is actually pretty representative. It's used, been used to study Brexit before. The results are pretty similar to YouGov and Ipsos Mori and those types of samples. It has the same sort of biases they do in that there's an oversampling of people who tend to be interested in politics. But it's the same matching exercise where you match up people, you try and get a sample from the panel that looks like a representative sample of the population as a whole. So it's a classic online panel sampling technique, and VoxPop Labs was pioneered by some Canadian political scientists initially in Canada, and then they've rolled it out in other countries, particularly in the UK. And it's what we liked about it as opposed to the YouGov one is it's got quite a large sample regionally, and so you could do Scotland as well. So we're interested in that. Yeah, we did break up Labour and Conservative. It looks exactly like Remain and Leave. So I didn't show it to you because, and partly that's a sorting effect. I mean, what is remarkable about what we've seen is the realignment in politics. And some people argue it's just Brexit has just accelerated a realignment that was already happening. Other people have argued that actually it's not, it's a new realignment. And what we've seen essentially is Leave voters overwhelmingly shifting to Conservatives and Remain voters shifting to Labour. And we've seen that over the last 2 elections. And if you actually look at it now, it looks like sort of 90% of Conservative voters are Leavers and 90% of Labour voters are Remainers. Where you roll back to 2016, it was something like 75-25 Leave for Conservatives, and it was 60-40 Labour. I mean, so we've seen that realignment. So statistically, I don't think it makes much difference. Labour, of course, is not coming out now as a soft Leave party. Partly, I think that's because they are very worried about being accused of Brexit in name only type stuff. They are obsessed with trying to win back their red wall voters in the north of England who shifted because they were Leavers to the Conservative Party. I remember talking to several people in Labour leadership, and free movement of people is just something that they will not touch. Their perception is that the vote was overwhelmingly about getting rid of free movement of people, Britain taking back control of immigration, and so they cannot be seen to be talking about those types of things. And I was trying to make the case that argue for the EEA and try and maximize your regulatory autonomy when it comes to the free movement of people. You've got more flexibility in the EEA than you have in the EU on these issues. The EU was willing to do a kind of break deal with you already in the Cameron deal, and they wouldn't even go down that route. So I think we're quite a way away from Labour coming out as soft Brexiteers. They're sort of different shades of hard right now.
So I have now Adrienne, Calypso, Lisbeth, and Philippe, and no one online, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll stay in the room. Adrienne, please.
Thank you very much, Simon, for this very stimulating talk. I have 3 questions. A clarification: when you made the survey, were those who were asked aware of the trade-off? That one thing you couldn't have when you had the other. Were they aware of this or not? Because you talk about packages, and packages always means a compromise between different issues. So that's just a clarification. And the second question is, what exactly does midterm mean now in your analysis? Is that 20 years? Is it 40 years? Because you said Britain will be okay, at one point, and that will make a difference for other possibly interested in an exit, right? So you have to clarify how long would one have to wait until one could realize that Britain is doing well, right, as a non-member. And the third question is then actually, you remember in your abstract at the very end that you want, given these data which you presented now, that will be important for policymakers, right? And then, of course, you have to say, well, which actors are engaged in this policy making? What are the external conditions? What are the preferences over outcomes? What are the institutional rules they have to follow? And only then you can say, it's in this particular way that these data will be able to assess in a way what a future outcome of a new, well, of a different agreement than the TAC will be.
answer this quickly. I mean, you're right. I mean, that's a kind of throwaway statement. You're right. I should be more precise about that. I guess what I'm thinking is we were trying to think of a piece of research that might shape the debate, particularly amongst some of the politicians or commentators in the media who are interested in thinking more about medium term type issues for the UK. What I mean by medium term, I'm thinking, I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's, you probably know the famous quote he said, Brexit will eventually pay off. And they said, by what time? And he said, 50 years. I mean, I'm talking 10, I think. 5 to 10 would be my, a sort of 2 election cycles in the UK context, I think is what I'm thinking of in terms of, it may take longer. I mean, I'm surprised. It's really difficult to say, what do we want the UK-EU relationship to look like 10 years from now? It's like, there will inevitably have to be cooperation on market regulation, on security issues, on data, on environment cooperation, on fighting terrorism, all the other things, right? And I wrote on the Sunday after the Brexit vote on the Thursday, I wrote a blog piece and got attacked from all sides. I said that, look, we should be looking at the relationship between Canada and the United States. Nobody says Canada should join the United States, but they're very close partners on the global regulatory standards, environment standards, nuclear cooperation, security cooperation, data sharing, relatively free movement of high-skilled labor, and so on and so on. And I was killed from all sides because it was too early, right? Way too soon, and much too raw. And people said, we're not Canada, we're much more important than Canada. And of course, we ended up with a quote-unquote Canada-style free trade agreement. But that's where we ended up. Were the voters aware of the trade agreement? We actually did alongside this another sample where we actually gave people costings, estimated costings that would go with the packages. It made no difference whatsoever. So we actually used economic data from various think tanks. They'd estimated from the Treasury's own analysis, from the Centre for Economic Performance at LSE, from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. A lot of them had done estimates of what the costs would be of ending free movement of people, but allowing high-skilled labor, regulatory autonomy versus regulatory alignment on each of these. So we put the packages and we put a kind of, this is the cost at the bottom of each of the packages. It made no difference.
Yes, thanks, Simon, for brilliant paper, rigorous as always. And I mean, we share completely this concern for the middle term or long term. And, one other version of that that's kind of in the same spirit is I do hope and believe that one day the long term will also be framed by this British identity which will remain unique, which is to be a former EU member state. It's a very strange animal in the international system, FMS. And indeed, this was not what shaped the negotiations, sadly, but and it has implications which we could discuss. But I have one question about the model and one question about the politics. I mean, in terms of the model, or just some related questions. One is that, as you say, this is about fluidity and context dependence. And I wonder how because this is a snapshot at one moment in time, and there'll be another context if you did that again in 1 year's time. But is it not possible to capture projections in different contexts? So if, for instance, the geopolitics of it all really matters. If the UK citizen feels we're this little island and now China is horrid and we need to be with our European neighbors. So, how do you capture geopolitical concerns, or are they non-existent? But the second one there is, your free movement. The only alternative you give to full end of free movement is end of free movement minus skilled labor. And I just was wondering why you didn't have one with minus unskilled labor, given what's going on now, where suddenly, public, even Brexiters are waking up to the fact that you do need lorry drivers. And well, maybe you will argue they're skilled. What is skilled, what is unskilled? But, there is needs and they're becoming visible. So how do you decide in your model, you know, which is the minus when you go to the soft option, which is that you kind of give to the package, and why only unskilled? And how did you define it for people? How do they perceive? And the third question there on the model is, you've got this striking, and it's in your conclusions, your center, the trade-off between non-alignment and access. But of course, non-alignment can mean all sorts of things. And we can capture the fact that public opinion thinks non-alignment is, you know, they're not going to tell us what to do, and we'll just not copy exactly what the EU tells us because they're a hegemon and a bully and we hate them. But that's not the same as we're kind of ready to have high labor standards and, you know, higher than them environmental standards because we're leaders in COP26, etc. So there are many meanings to unpack in non-alignment. And of course, you're going to say, you know, we can't capture all the subtleties in a model like this. But I'm slightly worried because, not worried, but the part of the beauty of all this exercise is to open the path from public opinions inductively to a better future, if I can put it in a very simplistic term, of kind of more moderate future. And so these kinds of these things matter. So that's for the model. But on the politics, it was fascinating to hear your assessment about under the radar, because haven't we heard this so often by our Norwegian friends? You know, when we speak with our Norwegians, has spoken for many years, their deal has worked because they've done all sorts of alignments under the radar. They have depoliticized their relationship with the EU. And of course, the story was always, the Brits can't do that. You know, with the tabloids, it's just not available in the political space of the UK. And now you're telling us, well, it's happening. Whitehall is very clever. They know how to do this under the radar. I mean, I wonder about this. And also because I also wonder the extent to which the continent, the other side, will let them do it under the... Before, with Norway, the EU is co-conspirator in under the radar politics. But with Brexit, it's learned this new game. Look at how it announced its compromise on the NIP, on the Northern Irish Protocol. 80% less check, which by the way is not the case. It's not 80%, it's not like that. But they're kind of like getting the point of the tabloid politics, right? So I do have a question about that. And also because, you know, for me, one future of your paper, and this is another conversation, but, you know, is what happens on the EU side around these packages? So that's my two sets of questions. Thanks for a great paper.
There's a lot there, Calypso, as always. Yeah, there's always a problem with this type of research, which is external validity, right? I mean, you know, you make your own trade-offs between the internal validity of what you can get with these sort of experimental survey experiments and the external validity. And the weakness of the external validity is time and place. We did this in just before the pandemic. We did it in March 2020. Right? I mean, would we even ask the same sort of questions? Right, as you rightly say, there was no discussion at all about low-skilled migrant then. The only discussion was potentially high-skilled. And the perception was the reason why the UK wanted to end free movement of labour was to deliberately end this influx of low-skilled labour. That was what the public really wanted. And so there was never, it seemed like it would never be something that we'd even consider bothering asking about, right? But now we probably would. So that just tells you that the contextual nature of this. I mean, with unlimited resources, what you do is just run, I mean, if it was up to me, I'd just run conjoint survey experiments every few months and see what comes out. But you know, the resources aren't unlimited. But you're right. I mean, so I think there are some limits about what you can infer, and those limits are very context specific. I think a fuller picture will emerge with other people doing similar sorts of research. It's harder to do this research, I think, on the other side, because Brexit is just not that salient amongst the public on the continent anymore. It's done and dusted. The continent just gets on with its life, and Britain, they just assume for now Britain's just going to do its own thing, and people are sort of, the continental equivalent to the tabloid press, are reveling at the line of cars outside petrol stations in the UK and this kind of stuff. But nothing really beyond that. You're right about the non-alignment versus alignment. You know, the UK wants to be free to agree to align with the EU. But even that, I think, is politically still quite difficult. I remember a conversation just after Brexit when I wrote to a former student of mine who's South Korean, and she's in the Korean Defense Academy, and I wrote, "Hey Won," I said, "What does Brexit look like from East Asia?" And she wrote back this really interesting, long, detailed email. And she essentially said, "Look, if what Britain doesn't realize is if you're the 5th largest global economy, or if you're the 9th largest global economy, or if you're the 15th largest, or if you're the 19th largest, it doesn't matter if you're not in the top 3. You know, the 5th is the UK, 9th is Korea, and so on, right?" She said, "Look, the 3 largest economies, the EU, US, and China, make up 50% of global GDP, 50% of global exports, and 50% of global imports. And they set the global regulatory standards. And South Korea realized that and has now signed a free trade agreement with the EU and signed a free trade agreement with the US. Canada has realized that and has signed a free trade agreement with the EU and has signed a free trade agreement with the US. And all of those free trade agreements are essentially regulation takers. The price for access to those markets is to apply those standards. And the classic Canadian story is the Canadian beef farmer who has 2 fields, one field full of the fat cows designed, geared for the American market, pumped up with hormones, and the phytosanitary inspectors come and they say, fine, you can fill them with whatever you want. And then the other field full of the skinny vegan cows destined for the European market, where they're not allowed to feed them certain things. They've each got their own little cow passport and whatever. And they're not allowed to mix or touch or anything like this, but they're essentially just accepting that they're regulation takers. And Canada and South Korea have done that. And she said, the UK will eventually have to accept that you are going to be regulation takers. And that's life outside the biggest 3 global markets. Britain's not anywhere near that. And that's a sort of global arrogance legacy of the British imperial past, that they keep having to say, they don't want to say sovereignty. They have to keep adding the word equals, sovereign equals. And that's a sort of sign of weakness, not a sign of strength, that I think they keep having to insist on using the word equals every time they say the word sovereign. So I don't think we're anywhere near accepting the idea that we would even voluntarily choose to align with EU standards. Under the radar and depoliticization, I do think it is still quite different with Norway and the UK. The issues that I've seen where there's been movement so far in the UK are really, really, really low salience, like the CE mark. Even Erasmus is something which is too politically sensitive or politically dangerous, the Erasmus program. So I think, and you're right, on the EU side, I think the EU would be very reluctant to let the UK do the sort of under the radar cherry picking, because that would undermine, I think, where they started off in their relationship. But it's still early days, but good questions.
Lisbeth is next.
Thank you, Simon, for just incredibly informed and entertaining discussion of Brexit. It's real fun, and I miss Bridget. So let me begin by a question that, or a statement that she no doubt would have made about Northern Ireland, obviously. Could or is the whole brouhaha around Northern Ireland maybe deliberately used, or could it be used as a wedge to incrementally go to some sort of softening, rethinking, realigning, of these 2 big, well, 5th largest economy and 1st or 2nd largest economy, realigning some mutual cherry picking without obviously studiously avoiding the word cherry picking. So Northern Ireland in the story, where is its place in your story? And my second question is going back to this medium term, discussion we've been having. Let me just say that when Brexit happened, and once the reality was there, Gary and I immediately said, this is going to be stuck for a generation, at least a generation. And I think so for 2 reasons. One, the institutional status quo has shifted. It now certainly has, now that there is an agreement, however contested it is. And altering that, I don't have to tell you that as an institutionalist, is incredibly difficult. So that, everything is biased towards something around the status quo that we currently have. But the other thing is, of course, the kind of hardening that we've seen, which is even more than we could have imagined in 2016, the hardening along the Leave versus Remain sides, which sort of reinforces that difficult to shift the status quo in any radical form, and that probably is behind Labour's deep reluctance to even talk about the issue. But what I was struck in your presentation, and this is my last, it's kind of an observation. You started by saying, so few people have thought about the medium term. But at the end of your talk, you were talking about short-term business cycles. And I just wonder how you square these things. I mean, does the short term really matter, given the status quo, given, I think also these your focus on medium term, which I thought is incredibly important in the discussion.
Where to start with this? Yeah, Northern Ireland, I think it could well push the UK towards a certain set of agreements that would make the Northern Ireland Protocol work. For example, a phytosanitary agreement. I don't think the UK would be even discussing that type of agreement had it not been for Northern Ireland. So I think that's right. Beyond that, though, the big issue would have been customs union, which May was considering. The UK remaining in the customs union, mainly because of Northern Ireland. And it's interesting that has not come back on the table. The irony with the Scotland debate is we're seeing complete reversal of the Northern Ireland debate. So all of the people who thought there could be electronic solutions to the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic are on the side of there cannot be electronic solutions to the border between an independent Scotland and England. And all the people who said there could not be are now saying there can be. So the complete reversal in position there, which I find interesting. On the institutional status quo, I think the bigger question here on the institutional status quo is there seems to be very little discussion of what is going to be the institutional architecture for governing our continent as a whole. And maybe I would say that as a Brit outside the EU, but I found the Bruegel continental partnership idea, which came out in the summer of, those guys worked on it over August and September of 2016 and then published it in September. It's worth going back to look at it. It's a very interesting idea they came up with. And this was pretty high, Gunther and Wolf, some pretty, who was the guy from France? Pisani-Ferry, and so some pretty high profile people from different member states. And the idea was to say, look, we essentially have now a market on a continental scale, which is beyond the borders of the EU. How do we govern that market on a continental scale? And that market is now going to include the UK outside the EU. And we need a new architecture for thinking about how we govern that market. And they proposed what they call a continental council. And in a sense, it was an acceptance of a two-tier Europe. And I do think that will need to be back on the table. So I'm surprised, for example, there isn't a debate now about why isn't there an annual European summit, maybe the day after the EU summit, which would have the Brits at the table and the Norwegians and the Swiss and whoever else you might want to invite, Turkey, right? That would talk about security issues or migration issues or environment, global environment standards or pan-European regulatory cooperation or something. That architecture and the debate about that architecture is missing. And what's interesting is the EU does not want to discuss it. And I think there's a reluctance from the EU side to discuss it because they don't want to make the boundary between the EU, being in the EU and outside the EU too porous. And it's interesting, it's from both sides. I was in Bucharest and they don't want to discuss it because they think that if you discuss that, then they're going to be pushed out because then it might be convenient. Actually, the Romanians and Bulgarians, we kind of would like them on the second tier. So they don't want to discuss a sort of continental architecture and so on. So, but I do think there needs to be a debate about that. And I think that that's quite problematic, given now the size of the economies outside the EU that are essentially cooperating with or part of, broadly speaking, the single market. Leave and Remain have hardened. Sarah Hobart, Thomas Leeper and co have identified very clearly that the Leave Remain polarization is now stronger than the party polarization in the UK. It's an effective polarization. Remain voters don't want their kids to marry Leave voters. Leave voters don't seem to care very much. The idea of my kids marrying a Leave voter, oh my God. But it's become an effective polarization in the UK. I don't know how long that's going to last. It's definitely shaped a whole generation of people in the UK. And I think it's because the process has run and run and run and run and run. It's been a dominant feature of British politics for 5 years, 2016 to 2021, and it's going to carry on afterwards. I mean, Brexit is not over. It's going to run and run. And the longer it goes on, the more it's a sort of the Leave-Remain divide is a gaping sore within families, within friendship groups, and so on. And that is very difficult to overcome in the UK context. Short versus medium term. I guess, we could accept John Maynard Keynes and say in the long run we're all dead, so we should only focus on the short run. But I tend to think if we can think about what we want the medium term relationship to be, that helps you structure what you would do in the short term. So if you say in the medium term, actually we think there should be cooperation on free movement of people for certain categories of labour. That then starts a conversation to say, okay, that should be mutual. That shouldn't just be unilateral, that should be mutual. So if we're going to have an arrangement that says we'd like high-skilled labour to come to the UK, we want a deal that says high-skilled UK labour can go the other way. So that should be then an add-on structured in the treaty somehow. And so I think if you can articulate what that medium-term relationship is, that then helps you think about what are the add-ons in the short term we want to add now to get to that relationship in the medium term. And I think that's, I guess, how I'm thinking.
Thank you. Philip?
My question was also on the medium term and has been answered. Thank you.
Okay, then we can go to Hans-Peter.
I'm also talking about the medium term, but in a different way. You showed us this graph where over time, the remainers and leavers, as you say, the size of them varies according to context, you said. But and now you say remainers and leavers have become identities which are effectively polarized and relatively stable. These people who change according to context are plus minus 5%. So these, I would say, are the hard-nosed utilitarians. They are not principled. They look at what is good for Britain and what is bad for Britain. Now, I would like to know, maybe it's not possible, but it would be very interesting to know, how are these hard-nosed utilitarians, who are in the final analysis decisive for the outcome of a possible vote, how are they doing in your experiments? What is their preferred solution? And you did the experiment at a certain moment in time. Is the certain moment, I think spring 2020, you said, is that determining the outcome of the experiment when it depends on these hard-nosed utilitarians?
Your interpretation is more or less right, but let me clarify something a little bit. What I showed you was people who think whether the question was, do you think the UK was right or wrong to vote to leave the EU? Now, actually, if you ask people remain, leave, it's much more stable. So interestingly, you get people say, I'm in favor of leave and I'd still vote leave, even though I thought we were wrong to do it, which is bizarre. But you still get that in there. But you're right, there is some fluctuation. In fact, if you just look at the YouGov Remain leave data or the Ipsos Mori Remain leave data, Remain are ahead. If you say, how would you vote tomorrow in a referendum on whether we should rejoin the EU, the rejoiners are slightly ahead. But it tends to be generational change that has made that change. So it tends to be younger voters coming in to the sample. You know, we've got another 5 years worth of voters now coming into the sample who are much more heavily Remain than the older voters who are dropping out, who are much more heavily leave. And that's one set. And the other set are the undecideds. And the undecideds overwhelmingly breaking for the Remain side. And it's the undecideds in those wrong wrong or right, which are the ones switching backwards and forwards between wrong or right. But you're right, the median voter in the UK is a soft leaver. And in a sense, that was what was frustrating about the Brexit debate. You know, the sort of, if you think of it as that continuum I showed you at the beginning, where the sort of hard, no deal, FTA, softer type of relationship, and then Remain, the Remainers were 40-something%, the soft leavers were the next chunk, and the hardcore Remainers were the next chunk. The hardcore leavers were the next chunk. We ended up with a majority of the majority, which is a minority overall. And so, you know, normatively, this says something about the British political system, the idea that the majority of the majority has a right to dictate the overall political outcome because they won. Well, they won, but the median voter was not there. The median voter was a soft leaver. And this is the median. So my interpretation is those guys are softies. They are, we want overall a close relationship with the EU. But I don't think they're politically powerful because I don't think they're pivotal voters in enough constituencies in the country. And I think that's a kind of side product of the British political system. And you can see the parties very much are targeting the pivotal voters, and the pivotal voters are in all those constituencies that switched at the last election. And those pivotal voters in the Midlands and the north of England that switched from Labour to Conservative at the last election are overwhelmingly not necessarily lower income or lower skilled. They're actually, if you look at it, Rob Ford has done some very good analysis. They're actually suburban voters in a lot of these constituencies. They're people who are, if you go to the north of England and drive around Yorkshire, these little towns have had enormous housing, new housing tracts built on the outskirts of these towns. And you can buy these houses for next to nothing. So they're classic conservative voters. They're homeowners who are sort of plumbers and electricians who've bought a nice, 2 or 3 bedroom house, and they can do because they're so cheap. And so that's the pivotal voters who've switched from Labour to Conservative, and they're pro-Leave, and their Johnson is speaking exactly to them. And those are the voters who I think are quite hardcore. They're cultural leavers, anti-immigration. They're more nationalist. They're culturally quite conservative. So that's very different, I think, to the aggregate pivotal voter, who is probably an urban voter in the south of England who's relatively highly educated. And they're just not politically influential. So I think that explains why we are where we are politically, as opposed to the swing voters that you're identifying.
You're next. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Maybe you can.
James Dennison from the Migration Policy Centre. So Simon and I discussed some of these points a week or two ago, and I thought the presentation was absolutely fantastic. And there's so many points raised there, some of which have been, there's also been quite a few questions that cover what I wanted to ask about. But I suppose the main thing in the presentation, which I hadn't seen before, which I thought was very interesting, was this game theoretical setup that you outlined, the bargaining outcome. And you showed quite convincingly, quite simply, that we ended up in this hardball outcome, which was kind of the worst case for everyone. So just trying to just pick apart that or add some nuance to that. That hardball outcome is very much a passive defensive outcome. Is there another strategy you could imagine which is trying to push the other side in another direction? So hardball in sort of the literal sense of trying to make someone do something they want to do. The other way of doing that, which I can't remember who raised it now, may have been Calypso, would be via dynamic institutions, continental partnership, rather than thinking about specific policies. And then at the heart of this game is an asymmetry, which I wonder could be exploited, which is the hardball UK approach is being driven by public opinion, whereas the hardball EU approach is being driven at the elite level. So is there some way that could be exploited to either, from the EU's point of view, changing UK public opinion, or from the UK point of view, changing EU elite opinion? Is there some way of exploiting that asymmetry? I don't know. That might be a bit too...
no, great questions, James. Clearly very well educated and trained, James. He was a master's student at LSE before he did his PhD here. Yeah, I mean, I think what drove, what I argued in that paper where I came up with that, it was a paper in Journal of Common Market Studies a few years ago, was if you just looked at economic interests, we would have ended up in a different equilibrium. We would have ended up in a sort of in an EEA type arrangement from both sides. If you minimize the economic impact of Brexit, and that was the goal, you'd have ended up over there. But for both sides, the politics was more important for different reasons. I mean, you're right that it was public opinion in the UK and more elite driven. Although the polls on the continent did show early on that a large majority of member states were in favor of being pretty tough with the UK. I mean, the French were the most in favor of being tough, but even the Dutch. And I remember, I can't remember who it was, Dutch politician giving a talk saying, you know, we are very close to the UK politically, economically, culturally, and so on. But the last thing I want is Dutch headlines saying we've done a soft deal for the UK because that politically is explosive domestically for me. And that's a sort of red rag to the populists in the Netherlands and who would want a Dutch exit. So the key thing that I think will lead to any change will be either a change in the politics or reduction in the salience of the politics and a growth in the salience of the economic interest. So if the economic consequences of Brexit are really, really clear for the UK, that will change the politics. But I think it's problematic, particularly when you've got the pandemic on top of things. It's very hard to identify what the real economic costs of Brexit are independent of the costs of the pandemic. And even so, the economic costs are sort of drip, drip, drip. It's like boiling a frog, right? It's sort of drip, drip, drip. And at the end of the day, I remember giving a talk to the Greek LSE Alumni Association in Athens. I didn't realize how many well-connected Greeks we had. And in the front row was Simitis, former prime minister, and head of the Greek Central Bank, and president of the University of Athens, and blah, blah, all sitting there. And I gave my talk, which was on the economic and political costs of Brexit. And former Prime Minister Simitis raised his hand and he said, so Professor Hix, what you're telling me is in the worst case scenario, Brexit will have a 7% impact on the British economy. And I said, yeah, that's what the economic models are saying. And he went, so I'd not thought of it like that. But that really put it in context that, you know, as a relatively rich country, we could swallow 7% spread over quite a long time, and the country can absorb that and won't really notice. So actually, I think economic consequences of Brexit are going to be very hard or unlikely to shift the politics, at least in the time being, will be my kind of view of that.
We have, I think, a rejoinable Adrienne.
Yes, I would like to go back quickly to the question on the European side, because I think it's really important in the future interaction to see what's happening in the EU, right? And there things are changing too. And short of an overall change of the treaties, but more kind of partial structural changes in which after once, you know, the time, now we are licking our wounds on both sides, right? But in a couple of years, not even midterm, I think shorter, there will be a search for constructive solutions in terms of cooperation, not only with the Brits, but with the other countries around as well now. So I think there is, because in the context of the European Union institutionally, a lot is moving, not, I mean, high saliency, overall treaty change, in a revolutionary sense, but in a very partial sense that actually these relationships will be able to fit in quite well.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think what I find fascinating from the EU side, and I've been talking to Catherine de Vries and Miriam Sarace about a European conjoint study on looking at trade-offs, institutional choice versus policy choice outcomes. So, you know, to sort of get a sense about, would you be willing to go for more majoritarian institutions if it meant that you could have the EU taking much more dynamic action on environment, on climate action, Or would you be willing to go for more majoritarian institutions if it meant that there could be an EU army, or or if it meant the EU really could control migration? So trying to do the same sort of design, but thinking about policy trade-offs from EU policy out. So here's a package, which is a set of institutions and a set of policy outcomes. And which is it, institutional choices people care about, or is it the policy outcomes people care about? And how do they make those kind of trade-offs? I think that's what we'd like to try and do over the next year as part of the future of Europe. Because I think it's the big policy questions, and those big policy questions, migration, environment, and security and defense in particular, are not just EU policy questions. They're actually pan-European policy questions. And so that, I think, will force the EU to think, okay, how do we not only do what we do internally, but also we're going to have to cooperate with the UK, with Switzerland, with also partners in Eastern Europe. And we've seen the big, one of the biggest festering issues, of course, is Belarus, Lithuania, Belarus, Poland border right now. I mean, what does the EU do with that? So migration, I think, is going to be one of the major issues. It's still a festering sore across the channel between the UK and France. And that's certainly not resolved. So I think that the things will shift from the EU side, and I'm optimistic that a conversation will begin about what do we do with a broader architecture as a result of those big policy concerns that the EU is now facing.
I'm not sure there are, so maybe something connected.
What Simon was just saying, unless you want to. Unless it's somebody else.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, I have a comment about extrapolation on the conditions under which you might want to do that. You see, in the past, when you thought about European integration, the major theories, or the theories that are on the table, treat European integration in its own terms, as if it was some kind of isolated phenomenon. That's true of neo-functionalism, intergovernmentalism, and also post-functionalism. And you essentially what you're doing is over your 5 to 10 year period, you're kind of extrapolating this domestic politics. And the domestic politics looks kind of pretty fixed, it's polarized. But if you were to ask me what is really going to go on, what's going to really kind of jog the situation, it would be the US-China conflict, or the possibility of conflict. And you just mentioned, UK, France irritations. I mean, AUKUS is, I'm not sure you can put it in the category of irritations. It's much more than that. And so the UK has thrown its lot in with the United States. Forget this notion of sovereignty. I mean, that was something we talked about in the context of Brexit. With respect to the United States, isn't it? We're in a different world. And then there is this, within the EU, there is going to be this enormous debate. There is this debate between France, both on center, actually left and right, for the creation of some capacity for geopolitical strategy. I don't know how other people around here may have a much better idea of how that's going to be resolved, but it seems to be a pretty intense discussion, maybe a debate. So that, I think, that's the wild card. And I think that would make an enormous difference in terms of the future of UK-EU relations.
Yep, I mean, we're getting into territory here where I really like the Dan Kellerman, Kathy McNamara paper that just came out, which is, they talk about Tilly and state building. Actually, I think what's missing in the paper is William Riker. Riker talks about the federal bargain. I mean, all of them essentially have the same sort of idea, which is when you get really genuine existential crisis is when you get a political union. And the EU, despite a series of crises, and those crises have ratcheted the process of European integration on quite considerably without us really realizing it. I mean, looking back and thinking, where are we now with what the EU has done in terms of response to economic and monetary union, response to a migration crisis, and response to the pandemic? I think the instruments available to the EU are quite significant. It's not quite the same as the Riker federal bargain or Tilly's state building, but what might happen next is exactly that. And if there really is global conflict of the style of what we might fear in the Pacific, I think that would be a major, major jolt to what does Europe do in that context. So yeah, and where does the UK go? I don't quite see the AUKUS thing. I think a lot of that the UK was just going along for the ride. I don't think they really, I think yes, the UK doesn't want to be on the wrong side of the US government. And what was striking about Priti Patel's speech at the Conservative Party conference this year on global Britain is she does not mention Europe once in the whole speech. Someone had I saw on Twitter, someone had map of the world according to Priti Patel, and there was like no EU, no Europe. It's just bizarre that the British Foreign Secretary thinks that global Britain does not include Europe in any way. But it's that kind of petty, cartoonish sort of politics that we're still in the UK right now. But they'll grow up eventually, surely. But anyway, question over here.
Thank you for this. Ciprian from Law. Please don't throw any stone. You know, at the beginning, there was a pretty considerable component on security, foreign relations, restrictive measures, and so on. If the agreement nowadays would have comprised of this part as well, would you think the agreement the architecture of the agreement would be different in terms of FTA plus the discussions you had and also the debates nowadays, or the security part was not that important for the global outcome of Brexit and negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, I always thought, I mean, I disagreed with a good friend of mine, Anna Menon, on this, because he was always emphasizing that the security issue is something really fundamental that the EU and the UK would need to do a deal on, would need to come to terms with. And I always felt that the UK had pretty strong grounds on that side, that would be a more practical, we'll have to get together when we need to get together sort of thing. We don't need to fix anything now until we actually have some kind of security crisis that we have to respond to, and then the UK and the EU will start to do business. Whereas here and now, the issue was the clock is ticking on participation in the single market, and this is going to be, there will be an exit day where suddenly trucks will not be able to come through Calais, and you know, that's a pretty hard-nosed, concrete deadline that focuses the minds on trying to get a deal or some kind of arrangement before that date. So I thought it was going to be access to the single market and regulatory alignment and stuff that was going to drive the TCA, and that was indeed the case. Not that the security and defense issues aren't critically important, they are critically important, but I don't think there's such necessary urgency to come to some sort of arrangement on that, and that's why there hasn't been that broader comprehensive deal. I don't think so. I think they see it as a sort of separate type of arrangement. I think the plus now, I mean, it's one of the pluses. If you say plus, 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 it would be one of those pluses.
Okay, let me just check with, I think we have two participants online, Stefan and Anya. 13. Why do I see only two? All right. Okay, thank you. Can I just ask, how did it work for you with this hybrid system?
Very well. Yeah, I could see the speakers and hear everything. I mean, once I didn't hear the person speaking, but otherwise it works fine.
Excellent. Very good. Good. Thanks. Thanks. So I think we are approaching 2 o'clock and the seminar comes to an end. Thank you very, very much again, Simon, for a brilliant session, and thank you everyone for an engaging discussion. So we reconvene in 2 weeks' time, and we will have Lisbeth Huge and Gary Marks presenting a paper on the social basis of political parties, a new measure, and we will be in the Sala Cappella, which is just next door to here. So I hope to see many of you again. Thank you and bye-bye.